Welcome to Dachau concentration camp. Concentration camp Dachau, or a KZ Dachau in German, was the first complete concentration camp the Germans built. The goal of this camp was to expel all who opposed the regime of Adolf Hitler and his political party, the NSDAP. Adolf Hitler was a very clever politician, something people tend to forget, and knew the rules of German state thoroughly. He let the government pop a few times until he got in control. After gaining total control and of all the seats in the government, he scrapped democracy out of the dictionary and was in total and supreme control of Germany. He gained power and was in control from 1932 on. During this period, he had to get rid of all who opposed him, who had other thoughts than the NSDAP, the National Socialist Deutsche Arbeiters Party. To get those people out of the way, they built the first concentration camp, or a Konzentrationslager KZ, near the town of Dachau, just north of Munich. The camp started out on the 22nd of March in 1933. Concentration camp Dachau was intended for political prisoners, communists, and pro-democrats, Jehovah's and Christians, but soon after others joined the inmates like gay people, Roma, gypsies, resistance warriors, criminals, and especially Jews. It was the first place in the German Empire where the SS got total control to do whatever they pleased without restriction. German and humanitarian law did not apply to the inmates of Dachau. After the essay, Sturmabteilung, Storm Detachment, the parliamentary wing of the Nazi party from Ernst Röhm, was liquidated during the Night of the Long Knives. Heinrich Himmler gave the order to expand the concentration camp. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, ordered the construction of a new prison. Dachau was not an extermination camp, although lots of the inmates died due to bad treatment, torture, experiments, or the gas chamber. Before Dachau was set up there were small camps throughout Germany with a capacity of only a few dozen men. These were guarded mostly by the SA. Dachau was built for capacity of 6,000 prisoners and became the training group of SS camp guards and camp commanders. During the 12 years Dachau was in use, it grew with multiple satellite camps in the surroundings. Well over 100 of these Arbeitskommandos were built in the region, spreading in South Germany and in Austria. The Dachau system was a blueprint for all other camps built later in the Nazi era. The prisoners were used in the war industry during forced labor. Dachau was the largest supplier of labors for factories like Messerschmitt, Dornier, BMW, AGFA and alike. On other locations, the forced labors were used for the construction of underground factories like the May 262 facility at Muhldorf Inn und Kaufering during Project Ringeltaube, Wood Pigeon. Dachau had over 30 large sub-camps where some 30,000 prisoners had to work, mostly in armament facilities, and they worked in such harsh conditions that many died during the war. The main camp had 32 barracks, one for clergy imprisoned and one for medical experiments. It had an admission at the main gate, a kitchen, laundry, workshops, and a shower in the main building. The crematoria are located in a other section just on the other side of the camp grounds. There is no evidence that the gas chamber is used on a large scale. There is a large prison building where inmates were locked up and tortured. The courtyard between the kitchen and the workshop was used as an execution area. The compound was sealed off with electrified barbed wire fences, 7 guard towers, and a ditch, and lots of guards. In Dachau, German doctors used inmates as living test subjects to all kinds of experiments. The results of these experiments could be used for the army and weapon development. Experiments on prisoners like a decompression chamber gave information for fighter pilot who worked on high altitude. Other experiments included malaria and tuberculosis research, or hypothermia for research in Arctic warfare or warfare in the Russian winter. New medication was tested on the inmates. Prisoners had to make seawater drinkable and try to halt excessive bleedings. How much G-force could a man withstand? How long can a man survive without oxygen? All these experiments were done without humanity. All was done under the supervision of SS Dr. Klaus Schilling. After the war, Schilling was sentenced to death in the Nuremberg trials. All experiments were battlefield related. Hundreds of prisoners died or were crippled during these tests. In the first year of the camp in 1933, there were about 4,800 prisoners. When the Americans freed it in April 1945, the camp and its satellite camps had more than 67,000 prisoners in them. About half were in the main camp. Just before the liberation of Dachau, prisoner transports from other concentration camps arrived. Himmler ordered the SS to transport all prisoners away from the upcoming front lines and dispose of all the evidence. The northern concentration camp had to move their inmates to the Baltic Sea and drown them. The southern had to go into the Bavarian Alps with the SS, who was to make their last stand in the mountains. During this period, 7,000 prisoners had to walk out of the Dachau camp into the mountains. During this death march, 1,000 died. Oskar Müller, the camp elder, sent inmates out to find the Americans and lead them back to the camp to prevent mass murder, which he feared. On 29th of April in 1945, the US Army liberated the camp. First, they stumbled upon a train with 2,000 dead bodies in it. The Americans killed the camp guards and let the civilian population of Dachau walk through the camp and let them bury the bodies. Dachau city is about an hour away from Munich. The realization of how much horror happened on these grounds hadn't really set in yet. The part of me didn't want to experience this. It is a horrible sight. But there was the part of me that knew it is important to see the ugly side of history. It is difficult for me now to use English because I am working now in Germany. My words come in German pronunciation also. But the exhibits were very well done in Dachau. They gave information about pre-war Germany as well as a broad summary of World War II. After Adolf Hitler was appointed Reich Chancellor of January 30th, 1933, the National Socialists used an array of terror measures to establish a dictatorship in the German Reich. The persecution and elimination of all political opposition plays a pivotal role. Concentration camps are opened across the Reich to facilitate the mass imprisonment of political opponents. The Dachau concentration camp is one of these early sites. On March 22nd, 1933, the first prisoner transports arrived at the camp set up on the grounds of a disused gunpowder and munitions factory. The camp commandant, Theodor I.K., introduces a system in October 1933 that includes brutal punishment rules for the prisoners and duty orders for the camp SS. The regulations institutionalize SS rule over the prisoners that is characterized by tyranny and terror. With the exception of the Dachau concentration camp, all early concentration camps are disbanded and new larger sites of incarceration are built. Besides opponents to the regime, more and more persons are imprisoned for reasons of racial ideology and social hygiene. These include sexual and ethical minorities like homosexuals and Sinti and Roma, persons who have repeatedly committed offences or led a non-conformist life are labelled criminal and social persecuted and committed to concentration camps. So over the course of the November programs in 1938, almost 11,000 Jewish men are sent to the Dachau concentration camp. Physically abused, they are pressed by the SS into relinquishing their property and possessions and are forced to emigrate. The Second World War begins on September 1st, 1939, when German armed forces attack Poland. At the end of September, the SS temporarily evacuates the prisoners' camp at Dachau to use the grounds to military drill the SS Death's Head Division. From 1940, more and more prisoners are transported to Dachau concentration camp from countries occupied by the German armed forces. Once the war begins, living conditions drastically worsen for the prisoners in Dachau concentration camp. The murderous working conditions, the insufficient rations, and a lack of hygiene facilities in the camp led to a soaring death rate. After the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Dachau concentration camp is used as an execution site for Soviet prisoners of war. The SS murder over 4,000 Soviet prisoners of war in 1941 to 1942. From 1942, SS doctors in the Dachau concentration carry out cruel medical experiments on prisoners. In 1944, it becomes increasingly clear that Germany faces certain defeat. With more than 30,000 prisoners, the camp is dramatically overcrowded. The catastrophic living conditions led to the outbreak of a typhus epidemic. The prisoners in the sub-camp complexes are subject to murderous prisoners and working conditions. Of the some 41,500 persons who lost their lives between 1933 and 1945, over one-third died during the final 6 months of the war. At the end of April 1945, the SS begins evacuating prisoners from the Dachau concentration camp to prevent their liberation by Allied troops. At least 25,000 prisoners from the Dachau camp system are sent on exhausting foot marches in the directions of Tyrol or taken away in goods trains. Several thousand prisoners die in the process. On April 29, 1945, units of the U.S. Army liberate the Dachau concentration camp. The exhibition rooms, specifically the prisoners' public spaces, had horrifying and grotesque displays for its visitors. It was hard for me to see the pictures of unnaturally slim people showering in the public area, to read the information regarding the daily physical abuse the prisoners suffered from the Nazi guards. The hardest for me, though, was the obvious murders that happened, specifically regarding the mock suicides. There were news clipping from the local Nazi wartime newspaper with multiple images of dead prisoners in positions that are physically impossible to do by oneself. The clippings would say the camp was a good place to live, but the people would decide to end their lives anyway. It was unsettling to know that not only were people murdered by gunshot, starvation and sickness, but they were also forced into mock suicides. We could go into the rooms that housed prisoners, and there were signs regarding who stayed in some of the specific rooms. The crematorium. This is where dead prisoners were gassed and or burned, and then their ashes were thrown into the grounds, creating mass ash graves. It is one of the few areas with original buildings that has survived over the years. There were two buildings. One was smaller, and the signs told us this was the original crematorium. When the camp was first built, it was designed to hold 6,000 prisoners. Dachau was actually the first official camp built under the Hitler regime and was the blueprint for all other concentration camps built throughout the war. The original crematorium had one or two ovens to dispose of the dead prisoners, but it was soon discovered that the camp would be well over capacity, so they built a newer crematorium with more ovens, as well as the addition of a gas chamber. The signs told us that the guards would tell the prisoners to take off their clothes because they were entering a shower. Inside the chamber, there were holes in the ceilings that looked like water could come out of them. but on the east side walls were two holes with gates over them. I would learn later that from the outside they looked like laundry cloths, and guards would put gas pellets into them, which would then release the poisonous gas to the prisoners in the chamber, killing everyone inside. This room was directly connected to the main oven room, crematorium. Saint Titus Brandsma, killed in hatred of the faith in the Dachau concentration camp in 1942, who refused to publish propaganda and was outspoken and opposed to anti-Jewish laws being promulgated by the Nazis. Father Titus forcefully spoke out against Nazis' anti-Jewish laws. Born in 1881, Titus Brandsma was a Dutch theologian, journalist and author, as well as ordained Carmelite priest, who forcefully opposed and spoke out against the anti-Jewish laws the Nazis were passing in Germany before World War II. In January 1942, when Germany invaded the Netherlands, he was arrested. The Nazis told the Carmelite priest, Titus Brandsma, that he would be allowed to live a quiet life in monastery if he would announce that Catholic newspapers should publish Nazi propaganda. When Father Titus refused, he shortly thereafter died of hardship and starvation in the Dachau concentration camp on 26 July 1942. He died at the age of 61 after he was injected with the carbonic acid. In 1985, Pope St. John Paul II declared Titus blessed, saying that he answered hate with love. Born as Anno Brandsma in 1881 in northern Holland, Netherlands, his parents, Titus and Titsti, were dairy farmers who made and sold their own cheese from their herd of Holstein cows and took their brood of 8 to daily mass. Although Catholics made up just 5% of their native district of Friesland, the elder Brandsma was a community leader and widely respected. Anno knew his priestly vocation from childhood. So when it was time for high school, he entered a Franciscan-run secondary school for boys interested in becoming clergy. Following graduation, the 5'1" student entered the Carmelite novitiate in 1898, took his first vows and the name Titus after his father the next year, and received ordination in 1905. After finishing doctoral work in Rome in 1909, he taught high school until 1923, when he helped found the Catholic University of Nijmegen. By 1930, Father Brandsma had served as a priest for 25 years. 2 years later, he became Nijmegen's rector, overseeing the expansion of the school and building a priory for his fellow Carmelites. In the same year, he became the university's rector. Adolf Hitler's National Socialist came to power in Germany. As Hitler grew in notoriety, so did concern about him. Chief among such people in Holland was Father Brandsma, Titus Brandsma. He lectured, preached, and wrote against Nazism. He rightly identified it as a neo-pagan system, one that would ultimately seek to subsume all religion and ultimately Christianity under its dominion. Less than 1 year after its decisive defeat of Poland, Germany invaded Holland on May 10, 1940. Fighting there effectively ended just 5 days later. Two factors put Father Brandsma on a collision course with the now occupying Nazis. In addition to the bishops having made him spiritual advisor for the Dutch Catholic journalist, they had also made him president of the Union of Directors of Catholic Schools. The press and schools were to prove important battlefield between the church and the occupiers and the latest collaborators. First came the schools. Shortly after taking over the government, the Dutch National Socialists, NSB, demanded information on every Jewish pupil in Catholic institutes. Additionally, the Germans decided to cut the pay of priests and religious who taught in schools by 40%. Next, the Nazis demanded the removal of all Jewish students from parochial institutions. Father Brandsma told headmasters to resist. Simultaneously, the Dutch episcopacy ratcheted up the pressure on Catholics who cooperated with the occupiers, denying some of these sacraments. This enraged the Nazis, but they knew they could not hit the bishops. Instead, they sought a surrogate. Shortly after the new year in 1942, they found one. In 1941, December, the government decreed the Catholic press could no longer refuse to run NSB press release or advertisement on account of principle, which the Nazis defined as ideology, but which the church saw as faith and morals. Since two church-run periodicals had already been suppressed and another one was barely allowed to operate, Father Titus Brandsma saw the need for Catholic media to resist. At the end of the year, he consulted with the head of the Dutch bishops, who sent him to embolden the journalists. Over the first 2 weeks of 1942, he crisscrossed the country, speaking with his colleagues in the press. Observing these actions, the secret police correctly conjured Father Brandsma's objectives and accused him to Berlin of sabotage. Then on January 16, the Catholic press printed a pastoral letter by the nation's episcopacy condemning the Nazis' tactics. In response, on January 19, the Germans arrested Father Brandsma. The next day, as Nazi planners in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee developed the final solution, Father Brandsma began his interrogation under SS Hauptscharführer Master Second Hardigan of Gruppe 4, Church Affairs. After an exhausting game of cat and mouse between the two lasting several weeks, Hardigan understood that the priest could not be turned. This essentially sealed his fate. Reporting to Berlin, Hardigan wrote, "Brandsma is genuinely a man of character with firm convictions. He wants to protect Christianity against National Socialism. He has written against our policy towards the Jews. He is anti-Nazi in principle and shows it everywhere. He does not deny any of these things but openly admits them. Thus he is to be considered a dangerous man and confined accordingly, as recounted in the book Titus Brandsma, Friar Against Fascism by Carmelite Father Leopold Gluckert." The Nazis shuttled Father Brandsma back and forth between various prisons before Berlin finally decreed he be sent to Dachau concentration camp, where it confined most clergy political prisoners. He arrived June 19 in Dachau. In the concentration camp, despite unrelenting pain caused by his terrible health and abuse, Blessed Titus maintained his inherent cheerfulness and optimism. Because of this, and because he was weak, the guards hated him. One broke his glasses out of spite. His fellow prisoners did what they could to help, but ultimately his conditions irreparably deteriorated. Wasted by dysentery, lack of food, and other maladies, Father Brandsma had no option but to go into the camp's hospital. Far from being some place to convalesce, it was actually where the Nazis did medical experiments on prisoners who were beyond all hope. During his days in this place, he went from bed to bed offering comfort to those who were in the same situation, and heard several confessions. Watching all of this was a Nazi nurse of Dutch origin, whose job it was to give people lethal injections, and who hated religion, especially clergy. As she observed Father Brandsma, she would sometimes mock him and religion. This prompted him to engage her in conversation, asking why she hated faith so much. Not long before she killed him, July 26, 1942, at 1:50 p.m., he gave her his handmade rosary. She remembered his last moments, and that he reached into his tattered pocket to give her his only personal possession. It was a crude rosary made and given to Brandsma by another Dutch prisoner who had been executed. He told her to pray, and when she laughed at him, he simply told her again to pray. When Brandsma died at and in Nazi hands on July 26, 1942, 3 days later, camp staff took his remains and burned them in the camp's old furnaces. By 1943, Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler had ordered and installed new and bigger furnaces. They were used around the clock to dispose of prisoner remains until April 29, 1945, when Dachau was liberated by a large force of American soldiers. The Nazis scrapped Brandsma's ashes out of the furnace and disposed of them in the camp's unmarked pit among thousands of other victims at Dachau. Inside this once mass-killing facility set within a leafy, banal German suburb that gives it its name. It is unknown the precise number of actual prisoner deaths that occurred here between 1933 and 1945, although 32,000 deaths were recorded. Sometimes in the 1950s at the Carmelite community in Germany, an aging woman presented herself to the friars, wanting to talk. It was the nurse. She came asking forgiveness for his hastening Father Brandsma's death. Later, at Blessed Titus' beatification in 1985, she was among the congregants. One major theme about Brandsma from those who crossed paths with him in his lifetime was that he was a man of positive vitality, charity, and cheer. The Nazis hated Brandsma's vehement and active long opposition to them. They finally arrested him and tried and condemned him as an enemy of the state in January 1942. Just 7 months later, in July 1942, Titus Brandsma was dead. His death was caused by the terrible suffering inflicted on him by the Nazis. At the very end, Brandsma, like other prisoners, was used as a guinea pig for Nazi doctors. To combat malaria affecting German soldiers, the Nazis experimented on prisoners, in this instance, involuntarily infecting them with malaria and then using exotic and dangerous drugs in an attempt at a cure. At that point in his captivity, Brandsma, already worthless to the Nazis since he couldn't work, and whose convictions they could not beat or dehumanize out of him, became a dead man walking. There were around 40 million Protestants and 20 million Catholics in Nazi Germany. A vast majority of Germans, including Germany's 20,000 Catholic priests, lived under the Hitler's ideology and were not persecuted by the Nazis. The Nazis wanted all culture and thought to bend their ideology, and whoever spoke or acted against that imperative were imprisoned and often murdered. The first clergymen to arrive at Dachau were Polish priests, sent there in 1939 for helping the Polish resistance against the Nazi invasion. Many of these nearly 2,000 Polish priests suffered the same brutal treatment as did Titus Brandsma, a regimen of starvation, beating, and involuntary medical experimentation. From 1933 to 1945, of the 3,000 clergymen who were inmates at Dachau, whether Catholics, Protestant, Greek, Orthodox, or Muslim, about 1,100 perished. Nearly one-third of Dachau's 200,000 prisoners, or 65,000, were Jews, many of them Germans and Austrians. Titus Brandsma wrote, "In the depths of our being, we come upon the activity of God by which He sustains us, and we are led and guided by Him. We have to go to its deepest source to rediscover ourselves in God." On May 15, 2022, Pope Francis declared new saints in the first canonization ceremony at the Vatican since before the pandemic in 2019. Among the 10 new saints in 2022 is Titus Brandsma O.Carm, who was killed in Nazi concentration camp in 1942. The priests' barracks of Dachau concentration, in German Pfarrerblock or Priesterblock, incarcerated clergy who had opposed the Nazi regime of Adolf Hitler. From December 1940, Berlin ordered the transfer of clerical prisoners held at other camps, and Dachau became the center for imprisonment of clergymen. Of a total of 2,720 clerics recorded as imprisoned at Dachau, some 2,579 or 94.88% were Roman Catholics. Among the other denominations, there were 109 Protestants, 22 Orthodox, 8 Old Catholics and Mariavites, and 2 Muslims. Members of the Catholic Society of Jesus, Jesuits, were the largest group among the incarcerated clergy at Dachau. A chapel was constructed in Block 26 and the first Mass held on 20th January 1941. 2 tables were put together to form an altar, and the priests made do with a single vestment and the scant accessories brought by Polish chaplain from Sachsenhausen. A Carmelite convent is situated by the North Guard town at Dachau, where nuns offer prayers for atonement. The convent housed houses the Madonna of Dachau, a statue of Mary from the priest barracks. Former prisoners are also buried at the convent. Blessed Hilary Yanusky, O.Carm. He was born in June 11, 1907 in Krajenski in Poland, and he died in March 25, 1945 in Dachau concentration camp. He was a Polish priest, Carmelite friar, of the ancient observance of the Catholic priest, who was sent by the Nazi authorities to occupied Poland to the Dachau concentration camp, where he managed to survive until 1945. Hilary Yanusky was born on 11th June 1907 in Krajenski in Poland, and was given the name of Paweł. He received a Christian education from his parents, Martin and Marianne. He attended the college in Greblin, where his family lived from 1915, and then continued his studies at the Institute of Sukharai, but had to abandon these due to economic difficulties of the family. Meanwhile, his family went to Krakow, where he took up other studies, and in 1927 entered the Order of Carmel. He completed his novitiate in Leopoli, and on 30th December 1928 made his simple profession. At the end of his philosophical studies in Krakow, he was sent to Collegio Internazionale Sant Alberto, Rome. He was ordained priest on 15 July 1934. He obtained his doctorate in theology and the prize for the best students of the Roman Academy of St. Thomas, and in 1935 returned to Poland to the monastery in Krakow. On his return to Poland, he was appointed professor of dogmatic theology and church history at the Institute of the Polish province in Krakow. On 1st November 1939, Father Eliseus Sanchez Paredes, provincial, appointed him prior of the community. At that time, Poland had already been occupied by the Germans a few weeks earlier. 1 year later, the invaders decreed the arrest of many religious and priests. On 18th September 1940, the Gestapo deported 4 friars from the Carmel in Krakow. In December, when other friars were arrested, Father Hilary decided to present himself in exchange for an older and sick friar. From that day, his Calvary began. He was sent to the prison of Montelupi, Krakow, then to the concentration camp of Sachsenhausen, and in April 1941 to the concentration camp of Dachau. There he was a model of prayer life, encouraging others and giving hope for a better tomorrow. Together with the other Carmelites, among whom was Blessed Titus Brandsma, they often joined in prayer. Meanwhile, in Barrack 25 of the concentration camp, typhus was spreading. To help the sick, 32 priests presented themselves to the authorities. A couple of days later, Father Hilary Yanusky spontaneously joined the group. In February 1945, in the course of a large outbreak of typhoid, Yanusky volunteered to serve those who were dying in an isolated makeshift building because, as he said, he was more needed there. He contracted the disease himself and died there. His apostolate lasted 21 days because, infected by typhus, he died on 25th March 1945, a few days before the liberation of the concentration camp. His body was cremated in the Crematorium of Dachau. Father Hilary Yanusky was beatified by John Paul II on 13th June 1999 during his apostolic visit to Warsaw, Poland. On this occasion, the Pope beatified 108 Polish martyrs of the Second World War victims of Nazi persecution. Let us keep in our mind what Albert Schweitzer said: I am life that wants to live in the midst of life that wants to live. Ich bin Leben, das Leben will. Inmitten von Leben, das Leben will.